To this session. I'll just give a moment to. If you could just find yourselves a seat, we can get going. This is going to be a great session, you should stay. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Mark Robinson, I'm moderating this session. I work at the World Resources Institute, where I lead our Centre on Environmental Governance. But I'm very pleased to be in this session and back to one of my old roots in state building and conflict work. I'm very pleased to have a great set of panelists, as you'll see from the programme. In fact, the programme is slightly inaccurate because my role is only moderating, not presenting. And Mamta's not with us today. So we have three senior public sector governance specialists from different regions of the bank who are going to address you on the panel, talking from their different regional vantage points, but on a common theme of capacity building and institutional development. Sorry, could we close the door, please? Thanks. In post-conflict environments. And I think this is just so germane because there's two. This is the very first session this morning I went to, and some of you would have been at in the room, was on the new WDR and talking about the security chapter from that. And I was very struck by a phrase which is, I think, so relevant to this session, which is when Nigel Roberts was asked about reflecting back on the 2011 WDR on conflict in a very sort of open way, and I think he put his finger on something very important. He said, one of the things we left out of the WDR 2011 was we didn't focus consistently enough on the challenge of building legitimate institutions. And that is a similar refrain when it came to the DFID paper, which preceded the WDR by a year, called In Building Peaceful States and Societies. And both of those important policy papers had the same gap, so to speak. They didn't pay enough attention to building up the core institutions of the state or the capacity of officials in the state to undertake their roles effectively and legitimately. And that's what I see as really the core of this session. So in some senses, this is a bit of a corrective, saying, well, what lessons have we now learnt 5 or 6 years on from those two important pieces of policy work? What lessons can we learn for the future? And what does this tell us about how we do state building, so to speak, differently in the current environment? And it is, of course, a rather different environment from just 6 or 7 years ago. So I'm sure that our panelists are going to be amply qualified to give you a flavour from their different regional vantage points with very different post-conflict and incomplete settlements to speak to this theme. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Verena Fritz, first of all, to kick us off with a presentation on South Sudan.
All right, many thanks, Mark, for these introductions. And I think, yes, this ties very nicely with some of the points raised in the previous session on what can donors do to build institutions. So this really tries to get into some of the nitty-gritty. Well, if we want to build institution, then what do we do and how do we do it? So let me first sort of raise one myth, if you want, that to start from. And that's capacity building is boring, and it's a second-order issue, right? Why do we, when we were discussing with some of our colleagues the proposal for this panel, we were asked, well, do you really mean institution building or capacity development, or, and what is that really important to have a session on? Can't we do something more sexy than that? So just to emphasize, really, if our overall goal is to have peace and development, and then underneath that are these ideas of we want to have state building, we want to have equitable and ample economic opportunities, and we have the political settlement, and then the sort of broader heading of institution building, of security, opportunities, skills, and transaction costs more on the economic sphere. Well, underneath this idea of having more stable, more resilient institution is really the need to have more capable states and more capable public sectors, as well as some clarification of institutional mandates and functions. So if we can't get the nitty-gritty right, then we can't actually get to these overarching goals of institutional development and of state building. So even if it sounds a bit boring and mundane, it is something that we strongly believe, I think, that we should worry about and think about with some effort. Also, what we are presenting today is really building on some recent and ongoing efforts to connect this bigger picture of the state building with this nitty-gritty questions of when and how do we actually do things. So we've gone from this ODI paper that I was involved in back in 2007 on understanding state building to taking a look at public financial management and how that can be strengthened in post-conflict environments, to having done recently some efforts around really public services and civil services, as well as about intergovernmental relations. And my own direct background at the moment is especially focused on South Sudan and on Burundi. And then this comparative paper has also looked at some of our longer-term experience in Liberia, Uganda, and Rwanda. So then comes this issue of, well, capacity development is technical and is largely insulated from politics and security issues. So is it something that we can readily engage on even when the politics is difficult, for example? Or conversely, do we think it is linked to politics and therefore it's just very hard to do anything about? So this is a little bit where we want to get to. So we have the political settlement, and then the specifics feeding into the result of institutional and public sector capacity is composed of recruitment, then managing performance in some people form, promoting the right staff, reallocating staff across different functions, setting salaries, and making sure that staff actually has things they can work with. And then also, of course, for the institutions to receive effective support from development partners. But of course, we see that there is a political layer around this. So often the recruitment may not focus on people who are most capable, but rather on those who might be potential troublemakers and who therefore need to be brought onto the public sector payroll to keep quiet. In terms of performance management, we often see that loyalty really trumps performance and who gets rewarded. We might see that those who have close relationships with political power holders get high-level positions, and everybody else can at best hope for lower and maybe professional positions. In terms of paying salaries and making sure that staff have operating expenditures, we may see that security functions are funded first and foremost, and salary second, and any other funding, it really comes down the line. And then in terms of effective support from development partners, which was really a focus of the previous session, we see that sometimes we see sort of a swamping of the country with technical assistance when the country is high on the diplomatic agenda, then a scaling back as it moves down the international agenda, pulling out very quickly or sort of quite suddenly when political crisis or conflict recurs, which can easily happen in post-conflict environments, complain that capacity building was a waste of funds, and then change all the staff, and once enough new staff and enough new managers are in place, who cannot remember exactly what happened before, you sort of start this cycle again. So there's a lot of issues with how we as development partners actually provide supports for capacity strengthening and institutional development in these contexts. Now, I don't want to leave, and then we sort of get into a blame game at the end where the development partners say, well, this is really a bad government. And the and the government of the day may say, well, bad donors, right? This is all this post-colonial, they have this colonial attitude and we're really unhappy. And so, you get into a bit of a blockage. At the same time, you also have to acknowledge that even in very difficult environment, there are dedicated staff. So when we go to South Sudan or we go to Burundi, we also find people who really try to do their jobs in very difficult environments. So that's something that we must not lose sight of. They're trying to do the right thing, even without much formal performance management. And for those staff, sometimes the threats to their own security can be a key challenge for actually performing their functions. So think of Ministry of Finance staff who try not to sign off on checks that they think are not being used for the right purposes, but they may face security threats if they refuse to do so. And these same staff have to grapple with uncertain and unreliable budgets, Good managers sometimes then might try to reallocate funds a little bit outside the rules to make sure that they can both fund salaries as well as operating and maintenance expenditures. And then, then we come in and say, well, you can't really do that, you're not sticking within the rules. We also have, of course, many staff from development partners working in FCS who are dedicated and try to do the best they can within these constraints while facing volatility both on the government side as well as on the side of their own internal authorizing environment. And I'm sure a few of you can sort of sing various types of songs about these issues. Another dimension that we have to consider is, do we even need public sector capacity, and for what? So do we actually need it for service delivery? So there's these three options. The one is the public provision of services. So state provision, which can contribute to legitimacy of the state, and it might be more systematic across the country, and it can aspire to be free of charge or to provide subsidies, subsidized access for the poor. And then we also have, of course, the option of private provision, which may be able to happen more quickly and reach more places, especially where public provision of services is notoriously poor and funding volatile. Private providers, say of schools or of hospitals, of course, must charge fees in order to continue and to survive. We do find that, say in Africa, many schools are provided at very, very low cost, so that's the positive part of it. But of course, for citizens, these costs still accumulate when most of the services they want to access are privately provided. So they have to then do that for water, for health, as well as for education, depending on whether there is any public provision accessible for them. Both more government and more donor funds could in principle be given directly to citizens to purchase services. So those are some of the ideas that have been launched. Why try to fix fragile states? Just give these funds that we have as direct transfers to citizens, and then they can buy services in the market for themselves. Isn't that a better solution rather than trying to build a state that delivers services in DRC or in South Sudan? That's possible in principle, but again, of course, raises some sustainability issues. So these tabs that provide transfers to citizens or could provide transfers to citizens can be turned off. And then the third type of channel is this provision through donors and charities and NGOs. But again, there is sustainability questions around that. It's also important to remember that some core functions will in almost all cases rest with national government or with the public sectors, including some oversight and integration, right? When you have private schools, somebody still has to run an examination system of who gets then admitted and graduated and can transfer to the next level. And then we do need to think about some greater clarity how to mix and match these approaches for different contexts and opportunities. Now let's assume we do want to try to do something about capacity development and institutional strengthening. What is it that we do and can do? This is just a very quick snap overview of some of the PFM work that we've done earlier to give you an impression. Well, we looked at 8 post-conflict countries, and actually in 6 of them there was at least some progress, and in 4 of them we had quite substantial progress that was made in this area over about a decade for most of these countries. But of course, a lot of it, especially in the PFM area, rested on the significant presence of technical assistance, and so related challenges about transitioning to more sustainable domestic capacity. And actually the findings from that report were, some of it really was what propelled us to dig deeper around this issue. Well, how can we actually then get this transition to national capacity? It's important to remember that capacity has a number of ingredients. So it's not just about the skills of in particular individuals, but it's the skills and the know-how of managerial, technical, and clerical staff. So it draws on, what is the level of primary and secondary training in the country, literacy and numeracy. And in a place like South Sudan, which is one of the lowest in the world, you're looking at around 27% of people who say have a basic literacy and numeracy level. Given that you only need a certain percentage, 6-7% maximum, maybe even a low literacy rate like that is in principle sufficient if you then do the right recruitment out of it. In addition to that basic training, you need tertiary and job-specific training, and that gets a little bit more difficult. And you need a good understanding of what processes people are actually meant to follow. And that's something we shouldn't underestimate, because in fragile post-conflict environments, there's often a lot of new laws, a lot of new regulations, a lot of other new things that are being introduced. And there's often very weak systems for rolling out who is meant to do what and how, including IT system and so on. And then there's sometimes also issues around knowing the official language. So again, we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is when countries switch their official language as part of becoming independent, as South Sudan has done from Arabic to English. And we see incremental improvements in many countries, but we also grapple with how to measure these. Then in FCS, selection based on having qualifications and then job-specific training is in principle crucial. Then there comes this process of hiring and the continuous management of staff. And there's often question mark over whether governments try to hire at least minimally qualified people, and people that are possibly recruited for other reasons, whether that's familial affiliation, whether that's they pose a security risk and have to be hired into more the security sector and so on. And we often also find problems with how people are being rotated and move in and out of the public sector. Then, in addition to that, we have this whole set of incentives and motivations for staff. So even when you have relatively staff who has the right skills, they've been recruited into government, do they actually have an incentive and a sense that they have an ability to perform? So do they have an intrinsic motivation? That's a big question right now in sort of research on public sector performance. Do they believe that other staff will also make an effort? Because if they believe, I'm the only one out here even trying to do the right thing, then it can be very frustrating. And you can, even if you're in principle have the skills, you may want to give up. Do staff believe that their environment and their pay is erratic and totally unpredictable? How would your performance be affected if you don't know if you get paid next month and you have to sort of go around and make sure that your children can still go to school and these things? And how risky is it to perform as intended by the rule book? So let's presume you are in place, you're trying to do the right thing, you have a rough knowledge of what the rule book is, but what if somebody then threatens you with a gun and says, I want my check issued today? Or I'll send somebody to your house at night. So that is something that's the reality for some civil servants working in Somalia or South Sudan and other places. It's not, it's not equal in all post-conflict countries. Some post-conflict countries have a lower threshold of continuing security issues. Also important to stress that, we have this standard set of approaches of how we strengthen capacity. And sometimes we say, well, really training courses, study tours, why do we even bother? But it's really what we try to emphasize is it matters not so much the what, but also the how these things are done, and paying, again, attention to some of the nitty-gritty details. So training courses abroad, for example, are costly. They're only available for a few people. They take a long time, and staff may remain abroad. But we, of course, also know people who have been abroad, gotten degrees within a year or 2 or 3, come back and actually have crucial capacities that we didn't previously have in a country and can sort of spread this. So we just have somebody who received an accountancy degree outside the country coming back to South Sudan and playing a valuable role in the Ministry of Finance. But of course, the selection of making sure that the right people go and finding ways to compel them to come back for some time, or at least the majority, is crucial. Of short-term courses abroad, that's another modality that we work with. Again, we can think about doing these things regionally to limit cost and select staff appropriately, and also make sure that we do follow up and monitoring of whether this is an approach that's working. We have the issue around study tours, but again, I can tell you many examples where people say, this is just a shopping trip, or no, this was really crucial for us to recognize, how this is being done in Ghana or how this is being done in Uganda. And you can sometimes do them as quite low cost to neighboring countries. And there's a clear benefit for people to see in neighboring countries that have struggled with some of the same issues of what can still be done. We've also tried to really look in greater depth at this dimension of doing training in country. because it's really what can countries potentially help to reach a wide range of staff, including staff from subnational levels, while, say, any type of training abroad is usually quite narrow. So we've looked at the Liberia Institute of Public Administration. We looked at the Liberia Financial Management Training Program at the Uganda Civil Service College. And you see some good ideas of how you can provide low-cost training in these contexts. It's not easy then to scale this up. So even if they train 1,000 people a year or so, that's still only a small percentage of the actual number of public servants that are present in those countries. A big benefit is that they can draw on, say, for example, on civil servants in the country to deliver some of the training, and they can make it really specific to what are the rules and regulations in this place. Because one problem is often that any externally provided or outside the country delivered training is way too generic and doesn't really help people do their job. Just some quick positive examples and the issues of seeing impact. So this financial management training program in Liberia really was a deliberate attempt made by the World Bank to make sure we have capable accountants in the country present within a specific number of years. So it's taken about 2 years to have the first batch graduating and entering into the public sector, and these are well sought after and make a difference to the ministries and agencies in which they serve. We still have some issues with transitioning them to actual civil service rates, but it's much cheaper, of course, than bringing people from the outside, who I can assure you in fragile states, often charge very, very high fee rates, and it's a huge cost. We have a regional engagement of various schools of government and training, so that's also a very positive example to see, and something that we can try to co-fund, for example, when they can deliver some of the learning, and we can provide some of the financing that goes around that. There is often also, of course, highly trained graduates. So time and again, you see some very well-trained people from South Sudan. And there's probably a bit more that we can try to push government to say, well, actually make sure they come into government and play a role. Sometimes even if they don't enter government directly, they can still come back to the universities and teach there and provide sort of a leverage for capacity development in that way. I would also like to sort of say something about this BSI and ODI effort in South Sudan. And it's, it's a bunch of people who have worked with the government in the Ministry of Finance over a number of years, some of them relatively young, some of them more experienced. And what that has become is a bit of a bridge between us, like the World Bank, and other big development partners who come with bigger bucks and a bigger bureaucracy, and the Ministry of Finance. So sometimes the Ministry of Finance is really struggling to articulate to us what specifically they need. So the Treasury Department may need something, the Revenue Department may need something. The Undersecretary doesn't really pay attention to sort of make a comprehensive plan out of that, what technical assistance the ministry would like to have. But I can go and I can speak to the BSI consultants on the ground, and I say, well, you work, in and out, month after month in the ministry. What do you see? And then they sit down internally with the ministry as trusted advisors and help us come up with a plan and try to see where are actually the gaps that are most urgent to be filled. And that's really been a very interesting model that I would recommend, because as a big and very difficult bureaucracy to work with, we have a hard time connecting directly, deeply into a ministry or an agency, understanding really what it needs. And I can't even fly outside of Juba, so I don't even know what's going on really on the ground for security reasons. So having some people who can provide these bridges and who are trusted by the government staff on the one side and by the development partners on the other side has been really quite useful in this particular case. We still need to, I think, document much more what works and how public sectors currently work. This is still very patchy. We have very little information often about patterns of pay and allowances, the specific institutional structures and practices, and how this, how have we really made some progress in difficult environments. Those stories, I think, still need to be written down much more carefully. There's bits and pieces of that, also from Princeton University. And we really also need more data and information that we can show what is being achieved. So in South Sudan, we have had one single civil service survey back from 2005, 2006 when they started, but we've never been able to mobilize the funds again to repeat this, to see, well, how has this evolved since then? How many more of these civil servants now have secondaries, tertiary degrees? What has shifted? How many of them now are able to work in English? So, getting to this evidencing and monitoring is something that we really want to emphasize, also to be able to compare across countries and across time. A few ideas of what development partners might try more of or do differently. So this issue of starting capacity development early and cumulatively. Agree with government how trained individuals will be used. So that's difficult to make stick, but it's probably worth trying. Thinking sector by sector about most critical skills and the mass of skills that are needed. So, the education sector is typically much more publicly staffed than, say, the health sector. Health sector in South Sudan is almost all Ugandan nurses, if you want to, say it. It's very external. And then how do you transition from that to a more publicly and domestically provided situation? So trying to develop some agreement of what will be considered public functions and services versus services that are based on these other models. Agreeing on monitoring frameworks on capacity development, and then how these will be monitored, and providing funding and technical advice on how to do this meaningfully. Discuss constraints to effective capacity utilization at higher levels. So finding a way to connect more this diplomatic level, where we talk to the president, where we talk to the ministers in the technical level. So I cannot, even if I wish for the best, I cannot go and talk to the president of the country and reinforce, you must send messages to your ministers about performance, about that you want things to happen positively. But I think we can sort of aspire to a better connection between work at these different levels. And we need to manage, of course, the technical assistance being provided more with a view to transfers of skills and capacities, and also of IT systems, which is something that we see as a hugely difficult animal. We put in resources, but then when TA is being pulled out, often there's little domestic ability to continue these, and take a more holistic view around that. Have a discussion about what should happen with capacity building efforts during recurrent crisis. So this is really the last very important point that I would want to stress, because I've seen both in my work in South Sudan and in Burundi that when the security situation turns difficult, we just pull TA out. And it takes a very long time to restart. And we don't know what to do about it. And then, so we reinforce this volatility that already exists in the country, despite what OECD and others have recommended. But there's, of course, also the diplomatic rationale. And this efforts around strengthening core government functions is more politically sensitive, and so is more affected by this withdrawal reaction than, say, our support to the health sectors and other sectors. So I think thinking quite hard about how do we get beyond this stop-go-stop syndrome is potentially quite an important one.
I'm going to ask Satyendra to come in next. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning. Not yet on the bed, so we'll bring you in next.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Is my PowerPoint on the screen?
Yes, I'm trying to pull it up.
Just fine, yeah. Okay, it's up.
Okay, to the next. I think this follows nicely from Verina's presentation. It is a lot more nuts and bolts on the capacity challenges that are drawn from Afghanistan over, I'd say, 12, 13-year period now. The presentation tries to draw together a different perspective, and the perspective is that by not getting things right early onwards, we create too large a problem on capacity somewhere downstream, and then we pay too much attention and devote too much resources and energy to try to fix a problem that we ourselves have created. Let me elaborate on this further. One of the things in Afghanistan, and I think it is consistent with the many post-conflict countries, is that there's an urgency for speed. Donors, citizens, the newly positioned government want to deliver services at great speed. The expectations of citizens post some type of a peace settlement are very high. Expectations are high. So in this context, there is incentives to go beyond and outside of the core civil service to look at shortcuts to delivery, shortcuts to accelerated delivery. And that is probably the right thing to do. But the price that we pay for it is that we create a very large parallel delivery mechanism, almost like a government outside of the government. And this parallel civil service, as we refer to in Afghanistan, is a combination of program management units, program implementation units by multilaterals, bilateral, NGO financed units that are working inside and outside of the government. And I'll give you some dimensions of that. The parallel institutions that are created, they do, now the evidence shows, very substantively harm long-term institution building efforts. And because the harm is of such a scale and of dimensions that they corrode or erode the legitimacy of this emerging state institution. So it goes right to the core, very nuts and bolts problem, but it goes to the core of state building agendas in this country. And perhaps the overriding lesson we learn is trying to understand this potential scale of the damage early on and putting in very difficult contexts, corrective mechanisms to the extent they are feasible and possible early in rather than downstream. To the next slide, please, the capacity challenge. I cannot see the slides on the screen, so I'm making it up. The capacity challenge. The three sort of blocks. One, there's high demand. There's an expectation for results, quick result. Citizens' needs are high, and financing is available in the post-conflict sort of. That's not the right term in Afghanistan, but in early after 2002 or 3 settlement. Then that is combined obviously with very low supply of qualified technical, professional, managerial, national staff, and very weak institutional structures that have suffered from years of decade and conflict, and structures that are not necessarily only corroded, but perhaps many of them are no longer relevant to sort of modern day bureaucracies, etc. And this creates the momentum or incentives for a large parallel civil service to emerge. One very important dimension of this is that in this large parallel civil service, the incentive structures are very distorted. The parallel mechanisms that are put in place by bilateral, multilaterals, and other development partners, etc., are feeding off a small skill base. And so they rely disproportionately on incentives, pay, allowances, and these kind of things to attract staff. So a very parasitical context emerges, and this sort of it's very the government side, the core civil service comes out much weaker for it. Governments get locked. The Afghan government got locked for a good part of 10 years into this a cyclical capacity trap. Each time as capacity is eroded from the core civil service into this parallel world, the government would innovate, would put a lot of resources, including World Bank capacity injection projects, etc., trying to innovate, trying to attract and retain talent inside the civil service. But as soon as they put a structure and a mechanism in place, they're outbid by donors this parasitic parallel environment, and capacity gets drained very quickly again. So the challenge is how can you break out of this cycle? One lead I've already said is to try to get a framework in very early onwards, but at some point it needs to make a decisive break. Giving to the next slide, some dimensions of the scale. Our numbers are a bit dated on this, but the size of the parallel civil service, some in the top 8 spending ministries in Afghanistan, there's plus minus 10,000 national staff who are engaged in this parallel civil service, who are employed in this parallel civil service. The numbers are coming down slightly, but not rapidly enough. They constitute, that 10,000 is equal to about 4% of the total civil service workforce. However, the pay that they earn is nearly equal to 20% of the total civil service wage bill. So you can see the scale and the cost of this. The pay relativities between the core civil service and this parallel civil service range from 6 to about 16 times at comparable. It's difficult to compare and decide like for like in this context, but in some sort of rough, crude back of the envelope calculation, that's the scale of differences on salaries, allowances, and these things put together. What does result as a consequence is that there's a tension and conflict is ingrained part of the context. The core civil service made up of directors and deputy directors who are on the government's payroll have a policy responsibility, managerial responsibility as per their position over the development process. However, much of the development is through donor finance projects that are implemented through program implementation management units, etc. And rather than a collaborative and cooperative relationship, this is a relationship filled with tension. So it fuels overall institutional instability. It perhaps also fuels a lot of rent-seeking, etc. In this context, and certainly is not contributing to developing sustainable and legitimate institutions over the long term. So very clearly then, interventions are necessary to try to rein in the parallel civil service, to constrain its expansion, where it has already emerged as a very large part of the landscape, put in place mechanisms that can begin to reduce its size and cost as well, and also put platforms, institutional platforms that allow the capacity that has come into the parallel civil service, the national capacity that has come into the parallel civil service to slowly or incrementally or aggressively begin to migrate back into the core civil service where capacity and needs to be built. And to the next slide. And so in this process of trying to minimize the expansion or rein in the parallel civil service, the government has a very clear role to play, donors have a very clear role to play, and both together also need to do a couple of things. It is only in December last year that in Afghanistan there was agreement between donors and the government at a very high level on a harmonized pay scale. So the government put in place a framework which says that donors should comply with a pay scale that is sort of consistent with its own pay scale, slightly higher than its own civil service pay scale, and that when donors are hiring finance managers, procurement officers, policy specialists, etc., there's a way in which you can approximate this post to their equivalent civil service post, and then the pay and allowances are kind of mapped to that. So that agreement took good 5 years to reach. It did, of course, take a change in government to also reach that agreement, but that's another story. And this to us, to our team, has been fundamental in trying to bring about a regime change in reigning in the parallel civil service. It is so fundamental, and this perhaps finally lays the platform for investing in capacity in the core civil service and having some level of not guarantee is the too strong a word, but some level of confidence that the capacity will not be drained within 6 months or 12 months of injecting or being injected into line civil service post. So that is quite fundamental. To keep this in place as a sort of policy guidance, obviously governments have to lead on establishing such a framework. This is not easy to put in place because government is a rather abstract thing. At the end of the day, policy discussions are held with senior officials of the government, advisors of the government, who themselves may be beneficiaries of being on a payroll of one donor or the other, and you are asking beneficiaries of this framework to effectively agree on taking salary cuts and things like that. So that's very difficult, but certainly government lead is so essential to this. On the donor side, generally donors compliance, the key donors, the large ones, UNDP, World Bank, USA, DFID, of course, EU, that they agree to comply with these in their own programs. If you have a small subset of donors only complying, that you still move in the right direction, but they will face the same problems that the government faces because they'll be outbid by other donors and they will suffer a loss of capacity from their own programs and program management units to those of other bilaterals or multilaterals. And jointly, in the Afghanistan context, and I understand in several post-conflict contexts, we do have these instruments that at our disposal. One is to use multi-donor trust funds that you can lock in good practices as part of the principles of multi-donor trust funds, programs that are financed through the multi-donor trust funds comply with these HR standards, and that they agree not to undermine government capacity, that where programs that are financed through this multi-donor trust funds are disproportionately attracting talent away from the government, that there's some mechanisms that allow oversight of this. So that's kind of the shared responsibility to get this in place. Now, if
Satyendra, can I say two more minutes?
Okay. So if we've reached this pace, then I think we can begin to do what I've outlined in this table. This is there only for discussion. That in the first column, if you can read that in the top one, that would be a post-conflict environment where there's a very low capacity, highly dysfunctional institutions. We can do very little. In that phase, the type of interventions that we can put in place are putting in place HR frameworks, putting in place salary guidelines, putting in place common service areas such as financial management, HR management, etc. They can then grow. At the bottom end, at some point when the rules of the game are a bit better established, when regulations that establish civil service departments, etc. have fallen in place, moderate capacity has emerged, then we can take a bit deeper dive into creating cross-cutting delivery entities in the key ministries where HR, financial management, procurement, monitoring and evaluation, these type of functions are carried out by core civil servants, and they provide services to the whole range of donors who are implementing programs in these areas. So, thanks. I will end at that.
Thanks very much for presenting at such an awful hour of the night. Thank you very much indeed. Now we have Francesca Recatanini, who's going to talk to us about a very current experience from Libya.
Thank you. I'm going to try to actually keep this short and build on what both Verena and Satyendra had shared already with you. Libya is a very concrete case, and is a case where we actually have looked how to remain engaged in a situation, as you know, that is very volatile and cannot be defined post-conflict, is actually in conflict, ongoing conflict. And I think that was very helpful to have both the overview presentation of Verena at the beginning to stress the importance of capacity, and then the concrete experience of a decade of engagement in Afghanistan that Satyendra could share with us. And now we're going to share with you instead the experience of an ongoing engagement where we are trying to actually establish the foundation for our future engagement using capacity as the entry point. So here, let me give you, is a slightly different presentation than the other one, and the point is to characterize and share with you the challenges that we face on the ground, and why then we have focus on capacity. And let me also emphasize another element of difference respect to the previous two presentations. We all come from the same family. I work in Sierra Leone, in Mozambique, in Guatemala, on all the public sector reform that were mentioned before. But when I talk about Libya and capacity building in Libya, is actually about capacity building of the state as abroad, of the citizen, and of the business sector. It's not just about the capacity of the civil servant. We are actually taking a much broader approach, and this is done, and I will not emphasize it enough, I'm here talking on behalf of a team of people that is behind this. This is not just my work, it's a work of many different colleagues coming from different parts of the bank with different specialty, and I think that this is very important. So the point of these slides is simply to give you a sense of the challenge that we face. 40 years of a regime that basically undermine any concept of functioning state. And after that, several years of unresolved uncertainty and unresolved conflict. That's basically what this slide, the message of this slide is. Gaddafi held power until 2011. Under his regime, the state machinery, the government did not function in the way that we think a government could be functioning. After that, there was various stages of instability. And this led to never really to a process, a clear cutoff of post-conflict, let's rebuild the country that, for example, I've seen and witnessed in Mozambique and in Sierra Leone and in Guatemala. This was an incredible challenge for us. And so you can also see here, just to give you a sense, because this instability had some significant impact on the wealth and of the country. So here is stability versus oil production. And you can see that suddenly we are actually guessing oil production by the end of last year. We have no idea exactly how much oil is being produced anymore. But you can see how the chaos that the country has descended into. Now, from our point of view, and I'm going to be very, after what you've heard from both Verena and Satyendra, I'm going to be very provocative because we discuss it among ourselves, how to also stimulate your thoughts and comments. Should we be engaged in this environment as donor, as development practitioner, all of us? And if so, why? What should be our objective? And how? How can we make sure that we actually can do something that has an impact, has some impact, some effectiveness on the ground? And what should be used? What should be our priority? And are there any risks? That often we forget to think about the risk to engage in this environment or to actually be open. We know the risk, but we are never openly talking about this. So the bank actually started to engage in Libya before the fall of Gaddafi. And we started to have some type of technical assistance, like we had in other countries where they had difficult regime. We tried to open an office. We definitely started in 2012 to engage on specific technical capacity building activity focused on public financial management, statistical capacity of the statistical agency, and issue related to macro issue. Management of subsidy, of deficit, support to the Minister of Finance office and the Prime Minister office. We opened an office, but unfortunately the problem was that, and we started to engage deeply with selective engagement, what was called inside the World Bank deep dive. So we selected them to a few sector area, and we started to focus on those areas. What did we learn from this engagement early on up to 2013? Definitely, our approach was not pushing us to actually get to a quick fix. This, for the reason that Verena and Satyendra, and especially Verena in the initial slides, had emphasized. The technical capacity, activity, and initiative that we were trying to implement were facing a profound challenge, not only because there was still not full stability within the country, there were still armed militia during that period, and we were not able to reach and pass on the capacity to all the civil servants that we wanted to reach, building the state institution that we wanted to build, reaching out to the citizen to build their capacity to be active citizen and have active civic engagement, and to be able to help to reinforce the building of the machinery of the state. And also we were not able to reach and build the capacity of business leader. So we realize also that because of the 40 years of the regime of Gaddafi, the capacity inside the state was incredibly low, and across Libya was incredibly low. And that the basic structure of the government really needed some strategic rethinking. So before the last crisis of a year and a half ago took place, we actually stepped back and we say, we are engaging, we are trying to promote capacity, we are having deep dives and profound engagement on selected area. Maybe this is not the right approach. And so what we did, and the last two boxes are the one that I would like to emphasize, we felt that we needed to think about a much more comprehensive engagement that was about institution building, where I'm using the word institution in a very broad sense, where there are different parts of a country that needs to come together. It's not just the public sector. And clearly, the team in the public sector, in the governance sector, took the lead in pushing this. But we work very closely with the colleague working to promote trade and competitiveness, with the colleague working to support all the macro activity, with the colleague working, for example, on management of natural resources. We did it together, but we realized that having selected area of engagement on capacity was not getting us to where we wanted to be. Now, unfortunately, we do not control the political development of a country. And while we were in the midst, we developed this program, we had the support of the then Prime Minister, and clearly this came in collaboration also, was developed in collaboration with representative of other organization, donor organization, and we sat at the table and we talked to some of the top leaders. What do you think that we should start? Should we develop something that is more comprehensive, touching your citizen, engaging with your business leader at the local level, trying to actually identify the area where within, for example, different ministries, there were the biggest gaps in terms of capacity? We had everything together and we had started to deliver some of this. And then we had the crisis, the political crisis that materialized in the summer of 2014. When there was an election and the result was two governments. The previous one that will not relinquish power, and the newly elected that moved to Tobruk. So then it became again, actually, what do you think that we should be doing now? Should we, like Verena suggested, and is a very, and I can only share the experience of what we have done in Libya, because she was mentioning Burundi, the case of Burundi. Should we step back? Should we just disengage? crisis, we don't have one counterpart, we don't have a clear government, let's just step out. The choice, and I'm very grateful that we made that choice and we had the support, would actually to stay engaged with citizens, with business leader, and with the technical part of the existing public administration, now with the political part, in an attempt to actually continue to transfer knowledge and build capacity and build the foundation for when we will be able to re-engage fully. So the idea was to actually really think about all the pieces of this scheme. So not only focus on the public sector capacity, but really engaging with all the different parts that makes a country functioning and responding to its citizen, providing services, citizen participate, business can operate, growth can happen. For example, we have an ongoing engagement in Libya with the National Accountability Bureau, NAB, that is the supreme audit institution. And we have been engaging now for 3 years in a row with an exchange with them on building capacity, on the technical capacity that they need inside, on the managerial capacity that they need to manage their own human resources, and on thinking how to restructure and interact with other part of the state. How can the National Audit Bureau be able to engage, for example, with the parliament and parliamentarian? Which type of information they should provide to the legislative body? Which type of information should be provided to citizens? And we have been doing this with the hope that in the future we will actually be able, that this will be a body that will be able to fully function in the future Libya. So this is basically what I was suggesting. What we decided to do, first of all, we built on the existing engagement that we had and what we had learned. Part of what we did, we had the fortune to have about 3 years where we had advisors living in Tripoli, several of them, that help us to understand and establish relationship with different parts of the existing government. And that was very important, because what we did, we actually were able to extract information and understand where there was demand, where there was an opportunity to actually do some capacity building, where there was an opportunity to engage. So that is a very important element. I'm currently also working on Yemen, and we do not have that. And not having that first-hand information on how things are on the ground makes it very challenging. And I know that we were very lucky in Libya that we had that window of 3-4 years where we were able to at least establish some relationship and some trust with some of our counterparts to then be able to now continue to stay engaged. We definitely, through that, we looked at a very comprehensive approach that also had a strong support, not only inside the bank, but also outside the bank. And we focus on building capacity at every level where there was a clear demand and there was a priority for a need. And the focus, the final focus, was to really promote accountability and transparency. Because at the end of the day, with many of the comments that we had talking with NGO and citizens while we were still able to travel to Tripoli, was that they felt that trust in state institutions was not there. Before there was no trust during the previous regime, in the current chaos, there was no trust. So how can we rebuild that trust? And that's why we try to do something that really reach out to both citizens and the business leader and the civil servant. So definitely someone was mentioned, I think Satyendra, we use the mechanism of the multi-donor trust fund that we've been able to establish, in part because the program was thought together with our colleagues from other agencies. And so it was easy for them to mobilize and support what we had developed through a multi-donor trust fund program that now has been launched. And we try to actually have directing various forms of capacity building through workshop, study tour, experiences from other countries, sharing their process to transition and to state and functioning government, what we call peer-to-peer learning. You can see, I'm not going to focus on this, but the program touch on all these different elements, what we have put together. So we also, what I wanted to go back, we also focus, for example, one element that was emphasized to us as a feedback, to focus on leadership. Leadership within the public administration, leadership in the top level, that was something that we really probe into this request. And then we realized actually it will be important. But we also looked at many other elements, as you can see, and all together they help our thinking and engagement on building capacity in Libya right now. And we are doing it through selected activity of peer-to-peer learning, workshop, and direct engagement. So remember our initial question I had, should we engage? We decide to engage. Probably was a very unique sets of circumstances and factors that allow us to engage and brought us to this decision. And I will not stop to emphasize this. We had a knowledge that allowed us to make this decision, and we took a risk, a calculated risk. And there is a risk in this. And we decided to do it because we felt that then we will have a better capacity and a stronger chance to help the country once there will be peace on the ground, and to reduce the chance for relapse into conflict. And we decided to have a targeted activity with civil servant, part of my line got cancelled, citizen and business leader. All the three groups are bundled together, and that's how we are. We also have a set of activity that we are developing that target women, because one of the things that emerged while we were engaging and discussing with some of the representative of civil society and civil servant was that women will need special targeted capacity building activity to then be offered equal opportunity both to be part of as business leader and in the civil service. And we did it in a very comprehensive way. This is my last slide, and here where I wanted to end with a word of caution. There are risks associated with this. We are very early on in the implementation of this, and we need to think about and be very aware of this risk. How do we manage expectation? How do we make sure that our engagement is not having an impact, a negative impact on the activity of what we are doing, the reputation, and the reputation of everybody involved, which means also all the other donors. And let's be very honest, this is a typology of engagement in a crisis country, in a continuously ongoing conflict country, that is not sustainable in the medium term. So if you ask me, what will you do next if we keep on having the next 12 months, 18 months of conflict on the ground? The answer is that we are still thinking about it because we don't know. In the meantime, we decide to stay engaged and to build the capacity with the hope that there will be a better chance when we have peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much, Verena. Thank you very much, Mark. And I guess my first question is...
Can you just introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name is Sobir Kurbanov. I'm from public sector specialist in ECA, here in development assignment from Tajikistan. And I guess I'm ex-DFID governance economic advisor. And I guess my first question is, when I was passing DFID governance accreditation, I remember this framework of engaging with fragile states. The first question was, we need to understand whom we are working with. And for this, we need a kind of proper political economy analysis. Because, I mean, before we engage with the technical capacity building, we need to understand whom we work with. And it is very core. So, and as you know, I mean, in the FID and the UK government, there is various frameworks, including drivers of change analysis, political economy analysis. So I think that is very core that we conduct this kind of quick political economy analysis, and we have proper understanding whom we work with, and because that will give us the framework, provide us with the basis of kind of understanding how we target those committed constructive groups or coalitions in the government, and whether there is any influence, whether any kind of underlying dynamics the political dynamics, kind of forces, incentives, motivation. And yeah, so this, I guess, my first question. What concerns the capacity building activities, I think they're very important that we do with the basics. We start with the very basic trainings. For example, on PFM, it's very important to maybe focus on basics of annual budget process or trainings which are actually sustainable, driven by local training providers. Because very often I see that, at least in my country, I remember after the Civil War, we came with a very fancy kind of IT systems or started to promote MTF and program budgeting when there a very basic core of budget management and payment systems were lacking, and there were huge leaks of funds. So, and you know, because we were doing a PFA in Tajikistan some years ago, actually not that far from the Civil War, has happened. And third actually, yeah, sure, yeah, that's it, yeah. Thank you so much. Huh.
Thanks very much. Richard Hogg, Program Leader for Afghanistan. I'd just like to address mainly Satendra's presentation, but Francesca's, yours as well, a little bit, but very quickly. I think in a way Satendra has underplayed the important role of politics in the whole capacity building for results project, because what he has described has only been possible because of a new president nurtured in the World Bank, who has been fully committed to trying to make that process which Satendra described work. And he has basically forced many of his ministers to implement the program. And that was not possible under Karzai. Karzai made it very clear, although he paid lip service to the project when it was first established, one was very aware that the powers of the patronage network under Karzai just did not make such a project workable in that kind of context. So in a way, the political context has allowed, if you like, the program to take hold to the extent that it has, and we are in a process now where we are at least able to start to implement something which we should have implemented a long time ago. And it's the politics. And I think the same with Francesca's, you know, I mean, I understand your approach, but I'm a little bit dubious at the end of the day about, one, its sustainability, and two, how are you measuring the capacity you're building if you are in such a fraught political context. But I'll stop there, thanks.
Simon Gill. I work with ODI in South Sudan. Just one comment and one question. Just to illustrate that, which links Verina's presentation with the presentation on Afghanistan. One of the interesting things that's happened in South Sudan was an attempt to harmonise health salaries across both the NGO and government. So despite the fact that there's lots of problems in South Sudan, that was a very positive and constructive thing that was done. My question actually for Francesca, I mean, the words I took very powerfully from your presentation were issues around low capacity, but I also saw you referring quite a lot to comprehensiveness. And I just worry whether there's an inconsistency between a country where you've got very low capacity and a comprehensive approach. Many of us have been talking a lot about, you know, focusing on a problem, iterating around that, and I just heard you talk a lot about comprehensiveness, which I worry about, but I just wonder if you comment on that. Thanks.
Julie Leonard from PwC. I work on public administration reform and governance. I was also very curious about the results framework and how you're able to, what type of results you're looking for, these very short-term type of short time frames. But my other question was around the leadership training that you're doing. If you're not working with very top level of government, the ministerial level, how are you able to get the go-ahead to do leadership training? And if you give us a bit more detail on that. Thanks.
I'm Kulvinder Rao. I work in transport and ICT GP at the bank. And I've been working in Liberia, Mozambique, and engaged in a couple of other fragile countries. So I have two questions. First is on the sustainability of the entire effort. The capacity building, it's a long drawn-out process. Institution building, probably even longer. And our typical engagements are much shorter. So how do you ensure the sustainability? And the second part is what would be a good result metric? How do you measure that in an objective manner that the capacity is actually getting embedded in the system? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. This is very, these are very pertinent points, I think. So, I mean, I think the one point that I want to take up in particular is this issue of the politics matter. So clearly in Afghanistan, having a president, sort of having a good leader come in is a decisive change, right? And it helps to move other things. Perhaps my question back to you and to Satyendra would be, did the continued technical engagement over some period of time still matter to enable you to then get going or to sort of have a bit of a breakthrough? So does it still make sense to be there while you have Karzai, while it is very messy, so that when a Ghani comes in, and would Ghani have ever been possible if there hadn't been quite substantial support for keeping the country at least partially together? So clearly good leaders matter. We don't have good leadership in South Sudan, quite the opposite. So that is a clear restriction. But do we need to stay there and try to lay some foundation so that when an election happens, and we've also seen it recently, not in fragile context, but in Nigeria and in Tanzania. And so in Tanzania, PFM had been going sideways for quite some time. And now we have an opportunity to push. So that's a little bit the issue of clearly recognizing that politics matter, but then what do we make of that for our engagement? How do we handle that? And I think we have pointed that out, and also a bit in the previous session, there's still a bit of a sort of sticking the head in the sand. So if we decide to go ahead, then often our management doesn't quite know what to do with the politics and sort of packages it somewhere in the back of the risk section. And so I think being a bit more proactively and sort of constructively around that would be would be something that I would think we should try to learn to do more about.
Satyendra, next, please.
Okay, Sabir and Richard, I think. Yes, we should be mindful of the political landscape. Reflecting on what Verena just said, we should remain engaged, and when opportunities present themselves, scale up, scale down, downward, scale sideways. These are very much part of the tactics of how we do capacity in this type of environment. But one thing I think that is a bit different in Afghanistan for the last 5-6 years is we are in a damage control on capacity and institution building mode, and so. I hope the focus of my presentation was that in the early years, if we lay the platforms reasonably right, even in a very nebulous and undetermined sort of political space, if some of the foundations are laid a bit better, a bit more systematically, etc., then this large damage that is created downstream that we spend so much time and energy fixing, and that we require a sort of magical president to emerge out of some chance factors, may become a bit less relevant, but I do not know. That's a assertion rather than based on any evidence. And on the question of who we are working with, that's a very interesting question for many TTLs who have worked on Afghanistan for now a good 15-year period. It's been absolute rocket science trying to figure out who we are working with. You never know that the civil servant counterpart you are dealing with, does he or she very rarely enjoy a legitimacy? Is that person on the payroll of the government, responsive to, loyal to the government because she is paid by that? Is that person paid by USAID, ADB, World Bank, or some other bilateral, etc. They appear to us to be in line positions. They appear to us to exercise the legitimacy and authority of the state and the powers that are given to them by some Public Finance Act or Civil Service Act laws or things like that. But they are effectively, by and large, contract employees in a big pretend game, and we imagine that these are legitimate counterparts, and we are creating a sense of legitimacy rather than the substance of legitimacy. That is only now, as Richard said, beginning to change, where you have Afghans in line positions, beginning to be paid on the payroll, and having some stability of tenure, being able to remain in the post for 3, 4, 5 years, etc., and exercising the legitimate authority that is given to them on the basis of some laws that have now fallen in place. That's quite significant, but that's after nearly a decade of very different environment.
Thank you. I noticed all three of you dodged the results question, so I want to come back to that in a moment, which two of our questioners raised.
Yeah.
You ready to talk to that one?
Yeah. So, but actually, I will go backwards. I will start from the easy questions and then go to the toughest one. So the result, the impact is a little bit more difficult. The easy one, the leadership training. We have two different levels of leadership training. One of them is the one that we cannot implement. We are open-ending, actually. Richard provided comments when we were still at the embryonic thinking stage on our what is called inside the bank concept node of this program. And we operate along two scenarios, which is an imperfect way to operate. But so the current limited engagement, where we do not engage with the top political level, and therefore the leadership training cannot be carried out at that level. Leadership training done instead at the lower level. Within the civil service, we do not ask authority. To whom will we ask authority? So we use the established relationship, which goes back to my last point about risk, right? We talk about the importance of leadership, of collaborating across agency, all issues that unfortunately are done very imperfectly because of the current situation where we are operating. Now, in terms of more difficult question, low capacity and comprehensive approach. Yeah, I went very quickly because I didn't want to run out of the possibility to have you asking question, all of you. Low capacity is around the spectrum. We also, and this tied up to our colleague that raised the issue about the basic training, we realized that while in the previous, at the beginning, our focus had been to have an engagement that was very narrowly defined. And then we realized that that was not getting us where we wanted. And so we looked at a more comprehensive approach that, however, doesn't mean that we cover everything. It also means that we work with a much larger team. And many of us, this is not Francesca, this is about 12 people working across the bank, thinking about different pieces and trying to coordinate it, which has its own risk. But that was the issue. We realized that we needed to think in a different way. The basic skill, that's the other element that we realized. We also went in the early on engagement with Libya, focusing on very advanced PFM system that, however, were not suitable for the current situation. And now I'm getting to the impact and the result framework. We will be very happy if we can have a budget that is one document with all the entry in there that have all been agreed and they've been reconciled. We are not there in Libya. So that's, for example, a very concrete element that we are trying to push, and we have agreed with the other donor that have a part of the the multi-donor trust fund that we want a budget process, formulation and implementation that will be basic but will be consistent, where the number and the entry from very different ministry are all together in one place. Exactly. So you see, but we are aiming low. The other one is actually to have some basic service delivery delivered to citizen. So that's the other measure for us that is very important. We also are collaborating with NGOs that are Libyan, in Libya, and they have been able to actually collect information and reach out to citizens. Like Verena was saying, sometimes we are limited as World Bank, but there are NGOs working there. And they have created a baseline of the dissatisfaction, accessibility to service, etc. That for us is the beginning of creating a matrix. It's really imperfect, but that's how we are starting to actually collect this information. And the role of politics, because I know that this was also an issue that Richard raised when we were thinking about this. I must say that chaos has helped Libya to some extent, because rather than having a leadership not supporting this, we are operating below the radar screen. But this also linked to the issue to know with whom we are interacting and working. That for me is what really keeps us all up at night. Because in our case, we actually have to identify and make sure that we stay above the conflict and we do not take side in the current situation. So we try to be very comprehensive when we have workshop and activity, inviting people from as many different cities as we can, different political and religious affiliation. But you know, this is the biggest challenge that I actually see right now, and we are very aware of this limitation.
Thank you. I did want to have another round, but actually we're kind of pretty close to the 5:30 mark, and I think we just had the single question, so perhaps you... Well, okay, since I can see you're keen, so please do.
Yes, I am keen. Thank you for indulging me. Rex Wempen, Northern Resource. I'm a consultant. And my question is actually directly towards Ms. Recanatini, Francesca and Verena. Given that neither one of the states you're working in really has a functioning government, have you considered direct distribution of the wealth of the country to the people per the suggestion of Donald Kaberuka, the former president of African Development Bank? Since you're essentially running the country, like the state of Alaska, have you considered direct distribution of a portion of oil wealth to citizens, which would solve a lot of the resource issues, possibly? Thank you.
A nice final challenging question.
Okay, so this is very interesting. So let me tell you a story of another country where this is very interesting question, and I actually, given the current situation, and there was a very interesting BBC mapping of the militia group in Libya. So I think that even if we could start thinking about redistributing, I'm not sure to whom we will be redistributing. I think that we will be redistributing to the militia, not to the citizen. But there is a story that I want to share with you that really make us pause and think about it. A government in Latin America, where at the local level we were engaging in a regular sets of projects supporting accountability, institution building of the local government. And if you start to dig and scratch and ask the question that our colleague was asking, to whom were we really giving the funding of the World Bank? It wasn't not to the local government, it was to the narco-trafficker, because the narco-trafficker were actually financing the election of the local official that then was playing the system to protect them. Sorry for being so blunt, but this is actually some of the things that I have been firsthand having to deal with. So what I actually wish that there was a way to really target citizens and make them have access to the wealth. But we all know that, especially in the case of Libya, is limited to one part of the country, which we have no access, no control. And right now, what I think is the most important thing is actually to regain control of the country.
Perhaps just to add a quick word. So I've become a little bit, I come from a deep public sector governance background. So I've been a bit more partial always in my life to sort of public provision of, health, education, transport, and so on. I've become, looking at these countries, I've become a bit more partial to the idea that, private schools, for example, may be a good idea in some of these contexts. So, for example, you see a lot of private schools springing up in the peri-urban areas around Juba, where the state schools just don't exist, and they're quite low cost. The problem is, this accumulation, right? If citizens have to pay for water, education, health, for everything out of their pockets, cumulatively it's quite expensive, even if each of them individually is quite low cost. So that's a problem to address. And then in terms of the transfers, you run into the issue of volatility. So South Sudan, yes, it was very wealthy 2, 3, 4 years ago and could have redistributed quite a bit. But now this has crashed with the oil price, right? So there would be, basically South Sudan right now is getting a negative income from each barrel of oil that it sells because it has to make a high transfer to Northern Sudan. So then you also impose a lot of volatility that people get transfers, and then that drops, alongside an economic crisis. Apart from that fact, the government has never been willing to consider this idea. But I think overall we should think a little bit more around this fact. Can we just give some money as direct transfers to citizens and let them, say, purchase at least certain service provision? And then how do we assure a minimum of quality and standards around that and sort of progression, right? What if that little local clinic isn't enough and you have to go to the next level? And that's why I try to point out in one of my slides, we have to think of how these different modalities of delivery hang together. We sometimes sort of have this miracle in mind. Well, if the public sector doesn't work, can we do some alternative? And again, the alternative needs to be financed somehow sustainably, and that's something that we also have to be mindful, and it is usually embedded in some form of a state that has to provide supervision, whether it be of drugs, for example, making sure that drugs are real, that come into the country, that reach the pharmacies. So there's always some core role that the state must play and must play with some effectiveness if you want to have a functioning environment. And the same is also, we cannot just go back to pure humanitarian intervention. We need actually something in Juba. We need a functioning airport. Otherwise, all these food drops can't be organized. The Juba airport is full of parked planes that fly out and distribute food. So a minimum of a state is really quite important. Otherwise, the cost of humanitarian provision also increases further from what it is already.
Well, many thanks to the presenters. Let me just conclude with a few observations. I remember right at the beginning, Verena said this is a very boring topic to address, and there's something in that, insofar as in the excitement of the peace building and state building approach post-conflict, very often it was the excitement of building the political settlement and achieving the peace that often obscured the urgency of building up the state in a very systematic, nuts and bolts and slightly boring fashion, in a sense. It's not sexy. It doesn't necessarily get the profile, but it's absolutely urgent and essential to build these basic foundations. And I think probably one enduring lesson that many of us have gained is the failure not to have put that at the center of thinking through what is required as a big priority, in addition to building security and justice and creating jobs. I think that the slightly more depressing conclusion we've heard today is the challenge of sustainability and overcoming parallel systems is still elusive. In all the cases we've heard, that remains a fundamental challenge, and picked out by a couple of the comments today. And I think in terms of thinking through for the future, I think Satyendra's delineation at the end of different contexts to try and shape the prioritization and sequencing of different elements of public sector capacity building was a very helpful one. Because all too often I think there's either been a template model which has been conflict insensitive, or a failure to weave in the political economy into the choice of priorities and the sequence to be adopted. So there's still a very big agenda out there, but I do think this has been helpful to kind of set out some of the areas that have not been addressed so centrally as they might have been in earlier rounds of policy work. So many thanks indeed to all the speakers, and especially Satyendra, to you there in the middle of the night in India. Thanks very much.
Thank you.